So the ideal always appears as the product and form of human labor, the process of an intentional transformation of natural matter and social relations undertaken by a social being. The ideal is only there where an individual realizing her activity in forms handed down by previous human development. The existence of an ideal scheme of human activity distinguishes the human from the animal. What distinguishes the worst architect from the best bee is the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labor process, a result emerged which had already been conceived by the worker. In the beginning, hence, already existed ideally. One should note again that if we understand the head in a naturalistic manner, namely as material organ of the body of the individual, then there proves to be no fundamental difference between architect and a bee. A cell made of wax, which a bee sculpts, has its prior moment in the form of an activity of an insect programmed in its nerve center. In this sense, the product of a bee's activity is also given ideally prior to its actual realization. However, the forms of animal activity are peculiar to that species, which belongs or innate in it, inherited along with the structural and anatomical organization of the body, that is, directly in a material way. The form of activity which can designate as the ideal being of the product is never separated in the animal's body except in the form of its immediate real product. So yeah, questions or comments, and then we can probably skip the next paragraph at least.
Ralph's put a question into the chat. Maybe you could read it, Phil.
Okay, so yeah. Ralph,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I would like to ask this last sentence. Yes, is never separated in the animal's body, except in the form of its immediate real product. Is it correct form? Maybe it will be better from the animal's body. We cannot separate.
Not separated in.
Separate this form of activity from the animal body, because this form is implemented, yes, in this body.
That does make more sense. Yeah, if others agree. Any kind of either questions or attempts to summarize? So, I mean, the point which I think is interesting is it kind of matches, we could interpret it as working with what Lars was talking about last time, which is that actually he's saying that there's a level at which there's a kind of schema which is within the, like as within the material organ of the individual, where within the animal and within the like programs in the nerve center, we might say, from a like neuroscientific way, you might say, okay, well, the animal has certain schemas and the human has certain schemas, and that in some ways is the same. But then what's the difference that Ilyenkov is highlighting? I mean, we've obviously already explored it in past sessions, but it's probably worth highlighting this bit, that it's interesting that perhaps it could be read as saying that there's like a neurophysiological explanation that we can give about any non-human animal and about any human, and yet human activity makes some kind of a difference here. So just to quickly answer Sigurd, and then it would be good to hear from others. I think he's saying in the head as opposed to the mind. So if we think of the head as in literally an individual's head, then you could, I read that as saying, well, we could do like brain scans or something in theory, whereas the mind he's thinking of something which is in activity and not caught up in the individual. How do others read that? Like, why highlight head? I know there was a problem with translating head versus. Sasha.
Thank you. This fragment shows particularly clearly the contradiction in Ilyenkov's position, which I have mentioned previously. The ideal always appears as the product and form of object-oriented life activity. Otherwise, the living human body, which is the abstract basis of human life activity, human labor, must appear as a Cartesian mechanism. Accordingly, the emergence of human labor and human thinking on such a basis looks like an abstract miracle. If we accept the logic contained in Ilyenkov's reference to human labor as the only possible form of ideality's existence, then the emergence of the latter appears to be something entirely irrational. Once upon a time, there was a stimulus-reactive bodily mechanism, the functioning of which somehow miraculous ensured the existence of a living being. This being was not free at all, or it was completely determined by inborn or externally implanted programs. Suddenly, a miracle happened. This machine became aware of its unfreedom, recognizing it as a flaw to be overcome, and it started working for that purpose. In this case of Vygotsky, about the mechanical, non-free stimulus-reactive mechanism of the animal vital activity, there is an arbitrary sign that creates the miracle of the transformation of a wholly determined reflex mechanism into a free reflected subject. The reference to the humanality, the key concept that distinguishes man from the animal, comes from the Enlightenment philosophers' notion that the animal as a zoological individualist is opposed to the communal human. In reality, this superstition has little more than an ideological projection of the realities of bourgeois individualism onto the animal world. Today, when biological science is in an incomparably higher stage of development than it was in the 18th and even in 19th century, to repeat such absurd notion is to drag these errors into philosophy, not biology. There are non-social forms of life. There is no non-social form of life. Regarding multicellular life forms, this is self-evident, but all other more primitive life forms are exceptions to this general rule, are no exceptions to this general rule.
All right, well, so we will have this discussion more fully next time, because Sasha will be presenting his reading where these kinds of ideas are at the center of it. But obviously, if anyone has either a response to a brief response to that now, or another comment about this paragraph, then we can take it. Okay. So, yep.
Corina has something.
I think Suresh, then I'll go.
No, I was saying that Corina has something to say. You.
Oh, sorry.
She's raising her hand.
Okay. Go ahead, Corina.
Oh, I had a different take on this than well, a question really, which may or may not be a kind of response to Sasha. I don't know. But in the first sentence, he says, always the product in form of human labor. The ideal is always the product in the form of human labor, a process of intentional transformation of natural matter and social relations undertaken by a social being. Well, could we not include it's natural matter, that's nature, social relations, that's society. Couldn't we not include there mental labor with ideal forms that are developed by other human beings socially? I think that's missing there. And I totally agree with Ralph, who says we need to fill in the lacunae in this with the later readings of other later works by Ilyenkov, because I think it's quite limited, this description here, and I think Ilyenkov would have amended it later. I mean, the forms of thought forms, ideal forms, are also a kind of labor. Working with ideas is a labor. It's an activity. It's an ideal activity. So I would add that in there. I mean, if you take, for example, a composer is using music, Handel or Haydn was using music that, or developing music that had been composed by Mozart. But he, these are ideal forms. So he, is developing that in a process of labor. That's all.
Okay. Any other comments about this one, Olga?
I think that this голова, this head, may arise in the polemic with Dubrovsky and idealist of reduction type, because they производили, they think that ideal is emerging from the head, yes? And Ilyenkov makes a clearness that this head is not naturalistic head, but the common activity in social organized forms. This activity is ideal, and its nature is social, and maybe Sasha Surmava is partly right, that we haven't in the nature just pure individualistic forms of activity. But the question then must be put about the forms of this collective organization. And the collective organization of human beings is of such sort, of such kind, that every individual becomes directly general. Yes, he has in his activity directly, immediately general vector. This is the sense of head, of the head.
Thanks. Thanks, Olga. Sigurd?
Just think about the Russian word for a human being, the chelovek, as I understand. It's a very beautiful word because it's also about the forehead, the cello, and the vek, the eternity. I mean, sort of the eternal skull in Russian. So this theme of the head, I guess it's the голова, yes, as you said, Olga, and it's not only an Ilyenkovian theme, but it's a Russian theme. I mean, you have it in the Russian language, the eternal skull. What is it to be a human being? Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, just a couple of things on the head. It's a quote from Marx. It's actually quite a problematic quote from Marx. I don't think Ilyenkov would ever have phrased it the way Marx does. So what he's actually trying to do is translate what Marx is saying into something which meets Ilyenkov's requirements, which is fundamentally that the head is or the mind is social. So we're not talking about a physiological head. We're talking about a social mind. I won't go any more about that, but that the fundamental point being that he's trying to deal with a quote from Marx, which is very famous. I think that's why he's referring to the head, because Marx does. Mm-hmm. Then just to respond to Corinna, I mean, Corinna says that surely there's mental labour, and so aren't we missing out on mental labour here? And isn't Ilyenkov making, does he correct himself in later articles, for example? I would argue that the key thing, the key issue is what is the relationship between mind and matter, between idea and object, between thought and being. And at this early stage of philosophy, this is a very abstract issue, which you have to solve, because you need to be able to show in philosophical language that there's some kind of identity between thought and being. Otherwise, your philosophy will be self-contradictory. That's what Ilyenkov's doing here. So I do not believe this is an omission on Ilyenkov's part of talking about things like mental labour, the sort of examples Corinna gave. You can get onto that, but you can only get onto that when you've got a basic solution to the problem of thought and being first. So that's how I'd answer that. I'll leave it there for now. But I mean, it should be stressed that there is one more core point, which is there was, in terms of Sasha's contribution, there's another issue here, which is a relationship between inanimate objects, animals, and humans, and potentially three different kinds of thinking things, human thinking things and inanimate things. And that's another issue being raised, which Sasha's stressing, and we have to tease that out too. So that's it. Now I will shut up.
Thank you. Lars and then Ketty. Yeah, Lars, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, well, I seem to remember somewhere reading Ilyenkov that he talks about individual consciousness and social consciousness. And it seems to me that the heading quote here is related to the social consciousness. People working actively together to achieve something in collaboration. And the question then is, how shall we go from individual consciousness to social consciousness? Can't use. So I was thinking, is this matter unresolved now, or do we have any kind of inquiry into how the individual consciousness relates to social consciousness? That I think would be an interesting issue to proceed to pursue in the future.
Thank you. And Ketty?
A question occurred to me when Olga was speaking about the general, because Ilyenkov has the text which is called всеобщее, the general, and it was always perplexing for me how to connect these two notions. To what extent general is also ideal, but Olga now just manifested how this is shifted, and maybe she could rephrase her idea how this transformation of activity into generality takes place. But another thing that is confusing for me is how to correlate the general and the ideal. Of course, something that is ideal is as well general. But then why those two terms? Another thing is how to correlate the identity of thinking and being to the ideal. It is clear that the thing itself is not ideal. It is ideal only in the long pace of activation in the labor, and the identity of thinking and being, by the very fact that it is possible, is made possible by means of this genuine labor, but is all labor genuine? Because there is exploited labor, there is destroying labor, etc. So not all labor can effectuate this ideality. So just to clarify, one question is for Olga, for her to rephrase this shift from activity to the general. And another thing is, how do we correlate the identity of thinking and being to the ideal? So what is this identity itself already ideal, or ideal is situated somewhere else? So how to organize this topology of our speculation with it? As I understood, this question is for me, yes? Katie, will you help me if I will help difficulties with English, okay? I'm going to answer just the first part of this question, because the second is a sort of developing the topic, yes? Beyond the Ilyenkov's frames and so on. And what is the generality and ideality is concerned. If we depart from the Marx point that human being is an ensemble of social relations, yes, it means that every individual may be individual only when he or she, как бы это сказать, выделяется из
individual
steps out,
divides.
Steps out. Or do you know this phrase of Jacques Lacan that новорожденный, that a baby is not a whole individ. Individ means whole, yes, and a baby is not a whole, is fragmented divid, yes, and the whole human being may become only within social frames and with the help the human forms of caring of him, the same way as blind and deaf children were brought up by the Meshcherikov, yes, with the help of human things. These things расщепляют, split this living activity, his living activity, into two vectors. One of these vectors is to self-serving, to surviving of this organism, but by the means of general caring of it, to satisfy his need. This organism may only, the only way, by the human, and this means general means, yes, that is why his activity, living activity, is not ambivalent, contradictional from the very initial. This vector of generality is absolutely necessary, fit in or pertains, it will be better, pertains to this living activity. Is it, have I made something clear? Yeah, it's clear. It just confirms what I was thinking about. Thank you, Olga.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it as, yeah, there being a subject that's kind of divided or incomplete prior to the social universal. Yeah, so if the word is всеобщее, it is not it's more specific than general, as in the meaning of the word is like almost more towards Geist, rather than general. Would universal not be a better translation?
I would add that. Well, I always used in translation the general because universal immediately gets attacked by the post-colonial critics, and then we just lose this word. But I don't know. It's,
And just to capture, we can come back to it, but I think Ketty's other question, which perhaps will, as we read on, we'll see, I'll come to Paul and then we can come back to that later, is, if so, like, let's say, habitual labor on a production line or something, is that still a reproduction of the ideal? Or does it have to be kind of, some autonomy there? Okay, Paul. Did you want to say that point or anything?
Well, only just to clarify the point I made is that which Katie raised about identity and containing the ideal. I think you did. I think it must be present at this first moment. Otherwise, how can it then be manifested later? It has to be present. That's the only point I was making. So it's contained. It contains essence. The first moment contains all these things. It's through a process of negation and negation of that negation into self that we are able to, the idea was developed. So I think, yes, the answer to your question, yes, it is contained in that first moment of identity and being. That's all. Thank you.
But perhaps there is a contrast between Ilyenkov and Vygotsky here, because, okay, it's present, but present for who? I think that's, again, a question about, is it something which just needs to be present that the person's almost like developing into, or is it kind of present for the individual? Anyway, let's keep going with the text instead. So I think we could either talk about representation, which is the bottom paragraph on 11, and I guess the next paragraph about reification is kind of also about representation, so we could move on to that one, and then the paragraph after that, it's kind of specific forms of reification or fetishism, I guess. Let's have a quick look at the representation one. So, therefore, if above the ideal was defined as a form of human activity or a form of thing in the guise of a form of activity, then this definition was, strictly speaking, incomplete. Characterize the ideal merely by its actually objective condition content. The ideal is only there where the form of activity itself, corresponding to the external object, is transformed into a particular object for the human, with which she can act in a particular way without, by this, touching or changing the actual object for the time being of that external thing whose image is the form of the activity. The human being, and only the human being, immediately ceases to merge with the form of her life activity, separating it from itself and placing it before herself, that is, transforming it into representation, since the external thing is given to the person only insofar as she is engaged in the process of their activity. She acts in the form of this activity insofar as it is the final product in this representation. The image of the external thing always merges with the image of that activity within which the external thing functions. So maybe pausing there might be good. Probably a paragraph that needs to be broken. Karina.
Thanks, Kurt. I thought this was, in fact, goes to some way to also answering Katie's point, because it's the, if you like, the labor, the mental labor of representation, creating this external thing that is different that is the human, the human activity, that special human activity, and it's being able to distance yourself from it and look at it objectively as an object that makes it different, that separates you from it. And the whole argument now he's developing is the difference between, well, he's saying the reason that people have this fetishization is because they can't separate themselves from the process that gave rise to the fetish. They're engaged in it. But the developing a concept of, as Katie says, the unity of the identity of thinking and being takes place through this process of, if you like, distancing and then bringing back again. It's this backwards and forwards process and practice that is actually the activity of cognition. And so this is what then gives rise to a new identity. I mean, we are the ideal and thinking and being are identical. They're all in our body, in our physical existence. We think and we are at the same time. But in the process of cognition, we begin to separate out moments and things and objects, and then we bring them back together again. And that's the difference between the fetishizing, overlaying reality with your subjective images, and developing an identity of thought and being.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Sigurd?
Just are we simply talking about concepts, mental concepts, ideas, notions by these representations?
Not so much. Does anyone else want to say anything about that? Yeah, I'll go.
I'm not sure, but is there a question in Karina, yes, about the differences between fetishized image and a representation which is without fetishization, yes? Maybe the answer could be approximately such. When you can trace the genesis of this objective image, you have not any fetishization. If this objective image became some, как это сказать, темным, dark for you, unclear, and you cannot see its roots, and you prescribe this reality immediately, supernatural force, it is a fetishization. But the genesis of the both are similar. You are right in this moment.
Yeah, just Sigurd, very quickly, I think there's probably like some Kantian interpretations that would say concepts are representations, but I think one powerful thing about Ilyenkov is you can break from saying concept equals representation, that we can kind of, yeah, do without that. Andy?
I was going to, on that, the question about representation and concept, I suppose I think that Ilyenkov's adding two things to what one might think about concepts, what many people might think of when they think about concept. First thing, and the most important thing Ilyenkov's adding, is the form of activity in the form of the object. That is the most important thing in what Ilyenkov's saying throughout. Where there are adequate ideas, adequate concepts, I will say, there is a form of physical external activity of the human body in accordance with the object. You do not get adequate ideas if there isn't adequate external activity of the human body in accordance with the object of which you're having the idea. That's the fundamental thing that's new. The other thing Ilyenkov's adding here is the idea of representation, as in a symbol or a sign, an object outside of us, which is representing the object we're having the idea of. And that's simple. I mean, that's what ideal forms, which are designs, it's language, it's pictures, it's plays, it's anything where you've got one object representing another object.
I would add that we can have the representation of the object only because our forms of representation are social. It means that every object is representation of another human, or social wholity in itself.
Yeah, I like Persa's example that when we say the diamond is hard, we mean that if someone was to come along and try to cut it, they wouldn't be able to. Anything else about this bit, or should we keep going?
Okay.
Hey, George.
Yeah. About Katie's point, let me say one thing. Suppose I'm thinking of some very, very abstract mathematical theorem, something that has no connection to forms that I would ascribe it to in the real world. What kind of labor is associated with that? I just don't see it.
Thanks. Yeah, so what do you think? Like abstract mathematics, a mathematician is sitting and doing work, and they're trying to solve theorems in their heads. Is that still dealing with ideal forms if there's no outward expression, I guess, is what George is saying, or that specifically that there's no representation, or that there is no outward form of activity that corresponds to the objects within pure mathematics. No, any opinions on the maths example session?
I mean, there's lots of interesting questions like that. The fundamental point is, if you spend your entire life in a classroom fiddling around with signs and symbols, in the end, you're getting no knowledge. The reason those signs and symbols have a connection to reality is because of human labor activity. It's as simple as that. And you can then derive there's lots of interesting cases, like, what does the world, there's complex concepts, and one can think, well, the institution, what is the form of human bodily activity in accord with a general concept like institution? I don't know. There's lots of interesting cases, as well as pure abstract mathematics, that you can think of, which which form a problem, but in the end, it's a much bigger problem for Ilyenkov's thesis about the importance of human activity in accordance with the object. But in the end, you've got a much bigger problem if you have no basic understanding of human activity in accordance with the object, being crucial to ideas and to signs, because you've got your general case is there's a complete dichotomy between ideas and objects. You must better start off with Ilyenkov and then asking interesting questions like you asked, than starting off with a clue how the two things interact with one another, and starting from there. So they're interesting questions, but let's get the basics right and identity right first, and then ask interesting questions.
Thanks. Did you still want, yeah, Sasha?
I want to put a question to Olga. Firstly, in Russian. Что идеально представляет форма топора или форма зубов бобра? Всеобщую форму, природу древесины или некоторую социальную конвенцию? What ideally represents the shape of an X or the shape of a beaver's teeth? The universal form, the nature of wood, or some social convention?
I would say that there are two different questions because we have two different types of objects. If we say about form of beaver's tooth, it is natural object and it represents natural element, maybe. Yes, as you mean, I suppose.
It has nothing to do with any ideality, you mean?
Maybe we may say about, we may speak about ideality in your specific sense. In the maybe
I argue that it's not my specific sense.
Sasha.
Hold on, Sasha.
Alexander Vladimirovich, да. I agree with you that Ilyenkov's definition gives the grounds to consider the beaver's tooth as a form of ideality, because it represents the objects of his activity. Yes, natural, yes. But if we speak about...
Both Ilyenkov's and Spinoza.
Yes. But this definition is not quite complete, I would say, in Ilyenkov himself. And when we speak about X, yes, topor,
X.
about X, it represents not only the form of wood, yes, but represents socially determined form of activity with wood.
The exact form of my activity, my action with X. Where is the social component?
Never, no one individual can touch the nature if he already is not possessed by the community, and he only can act in the forms of providing the production or supplies labor for this community.
Okay.
Otherwise, there isn't any human.
There will be obviously a whole session where you do have an opportunity to talk about these ideas. We do need to get on with this text today. So we're going to go on to page 12. Could someone read the short paragraph to do with reification?
Kirill, may I ask, I see in the chat that Lars is sad because he can't see how an object can represent another object, but we don't speak about such a situation. Of course, individual is involved, and not only individual, but the social quality too. That is why two more dimensions you must take into consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and indeed, perhaps after talking about reification, we can talk about this issue. Anyone willing to read the paragraph which is at the top of page 12?
I can read it.
Thank you, Suresh.
The reification of social forms of human activity characteristic in commodity production bracket commodity fetishism bracket close is analogous in this respect to the religious alienation of active human abilities in the representation of gods. One already can quite clearly grasp this within the limits of the objective idealist gaze on the nature of the ideal. The young Marx, already a left Hegelian, remarked that all the ancient gods possess the same effective existence in quotation as money does. Quotation did not the ancient Moloch reign? Was not the Delphic Apollo a real power in the life of the Greeks? Kant's critique means nothing in this respect. If someone imagines that he has 100 tailors, if this concept is not for him an arbitrary subjective one, if he believes in it, Then for him, these 100 imagined tailors have for him the same value as 100 real ones. Real tailors have the same existence that the imagined gods have. Has a real tailor any existence except in the imagination, if only the general or rather common imagination of man? Quotation end.
Okay, so we have this
Shall I
ancient
continue?
currency. Yeah, okay, let's do the next one. Yeah, thanks. That would be great.
This analogy, based on a materialist understanding of nature and money and religious images, and whose true nature was later revealed by Marx, is rooted in the real connections of people's social representation with their real activity, with forms of practice in the active role of the ideal image. In brackets representation. A person can change the form of activity, bracket open, or the ideal image of external thing, bracket closed, without affecting this external thing itself for the time being. Yet this is possible for her only because she can separate this ideal image for herself, embody it and interact with it as though an externally, brackets, to her existing object instead of the real external thing whose image she is. Marx uses the example with the architect to explain the difference between human activity and the activity of a bee, to say just this. The architect builds her house not just in her head, but with the aid of her head, by way of representation, drawing directly drawing paper on the surface of a drawing board. She thus changes her inner condition, bringing it into the open and acting with it as though with an object different from herself. Changing this refined subjective inner image, she potentially also changes the image of the real house. That is, she changes it ideally in its potentiality. This means that she changes one sensually perceptible object instead of another. This representation with which a person acts instead of the real thing is embodied in the form of a sensually perceptible, audible, or visual word, a visually perceived drawing, model, and so on. In other words, activity in the form of representation, changing the ideal image of the object, is also sensually objective activity, changing the sensually perceptive appearance of that thing to which it is directed. But the thing in whose change this activity is expressed is merely the refined representation or the form of human activity recorded as a thing.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, we've got, starting with a famous example with Marx, difference between having a thaler as a representation of money. So that's an object that represents another object. You have the stuff in the pocket that represents the money. Anything to say about this passage or to ask? So I mean, it's kind of doing some reiterating, isn't it? Other than bringing it more into familiar things that Marx discusses and showing how what he's already said is within Marx. Is there much that's extra? He's again talking about representation. People are able to treat something as a representation. A human is able to take something as a representation in a way that a bee doesn't. Lars?
Yeah, one thing that I have been thinking a lot about is the architect here who works with a model, and because that is the same when we worked in my company, telecommunications. We have a model, that represents something that is to be realized. But when we have the model only, there's nothing there to be realized. We just have the model, because the physical object doesn't exist yet. So how should we think about this? This has been puzzling me for a long time. That when the architect works and when the people around there are a lot of people around you, the model, discussing the future outcome, the price, etc., etc. But the actual thing itself, the object that we are working towards, does not yet exist. So what is then the materiality in this case, otherwise than just the model itself? That is, I think, is interesting.
Karina, then Andrew.
Maybe Andrew wants to speak first.
Okay, Andrew.
No, you go ahead, Karina, please.
Okay. Well, this, although it's kind of riffing on Marx, I think these two paragraphs are quite amazing because, first of all, what he's really bringing out is the incredible power of the idea, in the sense that for the he says the imaginary Thaler has an incredible power over the person that believes in it. And I think, it's just, as we know, religion, and he's talking about this extract, by the way, about Delphic Apollo, is from Marx's very early writings on Epicurus and Democritus. But to me, I've found these passages incredibly important and powerful, because not just in relation to the ancient religion, but in relation to today's world, when we know the incredible power that, for example, all kinds of ideas have on people, and the continued grip of religion, the grip of Trumpism, all these ideologies. So that's the one thing. But the next paragraph, and it kind of links up with what Lars has just said, this question of the inner condition, and how in the process of creating something new, there's this inner labor goes on where you're working with objects that are different from yourself, and you're changing, as he says, you're changing you in your mind, and in the discussion between the different architects, they are actually bringing into being something new, in theory, theoretically, and in their imagination, that they then interact with the physical building of the model, and then eventually the building of the house. But I just want to add one point, which is fascinating to think about. Somebody like Stephen Hawking, who can't move his hands and operates his computer with his eye movements, or when he was alive, didn't have the opportunity to engage in what we could consider labor with his hands, or even with tools. He had to use his eyes to move his tool, and yet he could develop the most complex abstract thought, and not just abstract, but also concrete thought. And because it's a mediated thing, the computer that he was particularly developed for him was able to mediate between his concepts and the objects that he was studying, the black holes, whatever, gravity. So, this is a highly developed process in today's world, using complex technologies and forces that, including quantum mechanics and so on. So I think this whole thing is in Ilyenkov's study here. He has there is this developmental aspect that we can build on in relation to today's realities.
Thanks, Andrew.
Just in response to Lars and following up on Karina's response to Lars, I think the what you've got in these paragraphs and your question, Lars, is very much illustrating Marx's quote earlier, where he's distinguishing architects and bees. The architect raises it in his head, says Marx. Well, what Ilyenkov's saying was the architect raises it in these designs or in the model you were just talking about, and architects can look at the model, change the model, and then create something new. And so it very much illustrates what Marx is talking about, but I suppose it might be worth clarifying something at this point. There are two important elements or aspects to labour in Ilyenkov. The first one is this idea of a mode of activity which is in accordance with the external object. That gets you an identity, it gets you a way of understanding the relationship between idea and object in an identity, a unity, in a materialistic way. So that's accordance with. The other aspect of labour, which is very important, is labour changes itself and the object, creating something new. You need both of those. They're both in Ilyenkov's concept of labour, and that's often missed in interpretations of Ilyenkov.
Thanks. Okay, any final comments on this one before we carry on reading? Yeah, Sigurd.
I think the last phrase about the recording in things, it's interesting just to dwell around in relation to the problem of Lars on the status of the model when there is no result, no object. There are a lot of these kinds of models, modes of activities with no particular result. But when there is a result, when there is a house or a thing, it's a sort of tip of the iceberg, maybe. But it's beautifully expressed that it's a kind of recording of human activity, I think.
Thanks. Okay, Olga, yeah.
May I add, and I would like to clear this question of Karina. Does anyone understand why what? Who says that Kant's critique means nothing? Karina, it is your question.
Yes, Ilyenkov says Kant's critique means nothing. Oh no, Marx says.
This plot is the reference to the Kant's critique, to the criticism of the ontological substantiation of God's being. Kant's argument was, if we have an idea in our head, it doesn't mean that the object of this idea really exists. If we had a dream about money in our head, this money are only ideal, but those money that in the pocket are real. And Ilyenkov objects to this understanding of the ideal. He shows that real money, which are in the pocket, are completely ideal because they are nothing than social representation. If you bring your paper money into another country, when people don't know about this using of paper, you make them laughing of your subjective imagination, yes? And about Lars and Sigurd question about model, maybe the point is that the model is never just a copy of a physical object. The model as ideal object is the social, is a figure of need of social organism. It does not coincide with physical object, never. That is why it is every time the model of non-existing object. That is why it has potential to develop because of this difference and potential contradiction.
Yeah, so like the model of the atom, where you have the nucleus in the middle and the electrons circling around it, it is adequate to saying certain things that cash out in nature, but then different people in different practices will have different models of that. Lars?
Well, I completely agree with Olga here, you know, that the model is a way of organizing the social action. You know, it's this way of coordinating actions. So, and that is, I think, the real importance of the model. You know, not that it represents something that is not yet achieved. You know, it's a social thing. You know, that makes the ideal possible in a way. You know, so thank you, Olga.
Okay, let's carry on reading with the bottom one on page 12, if anyone can volunteer. Like right at the bottom of page 12. Paulie, was that a quick hand up? Thank you.
Checking my sound. Can you hear me?
All good.
Okay. When the ideal is portrayed as a motionless, fixed ideal object as a rigidly fixed form, then an unresolvable issue emerges. What is this form? For such a turn of thought translates the ideal into an independent substance, existing autonomously from living human activity as its supersensitive, non-physical prototype. Moreover, it is a form of the human dynamic activity conditioned by the form of the external world. It is worth registering it separately from activity, how it transforms itself into, quote, something transcendent, quote, with secret and mystical properties. An example of this is the difficulty connected with the understanding of, quote, number, quote, points, in quotes, and other, quote, abstract mathematical objects, quote, namely the subjective images of a quantitative determination of the external world interpreted as autonomous objects. The ideal is nothing more than an aggregate of universal forms of human activity realized by the individual, determining as its goal and law its will and manner of individual activity. It goes without saying that the process of the individual realization of the ideal image, that is, the abstract universal form of social and human activity, is always connected with this or that, quotes, deviation, quotes, or more precisely, with the concretization of this image, with its correction in accordance with concrete conditions, with new social needs, with the particularities of its matter, and so on.
Thanks. Any comments or questions there?
Kirill, there are some notices of linguistic thought in this paragraph. This sentence, moreover, it is a form of the human's dynamic activity conditioned by the form of the external world, and the further, it is worth registering it separately from activity, how it transforms itself into something transcendent, and so on. I am not sure, but the sense is, as only you fix it separately, it transforms. Maybe it is the same, but I am not sure. That is why too clear.
Thank you. Any other comments about this? Oh, Sigurd, is your hand up from last time, or yeah? No, okay. Okay, Ralph, if you have a comment about the previous paragraph, then do still share it, even though we didn't read it. And do make the comment if you want about mathematics, since we were asking about it earlier.
Yes.
If you want to, Ralph, you don't have to. You're unmuted, but for some reason, oh, maybe you're frozen. I think possibly Ralph froze, but when he returns, we look forward to a point about. Okay, well, when Ralph unfreezes, you can make that point. Anyone else on the paragraph we just read, Karina?
Just, I think this actually illustrates and develops Olga's point here, because what he's talking about when he says, when she mentioned the model is never the same as the reality, which I think is a very important idea to think about. The same as our mental concepts are never the same, exactly the same as well. There is an identity, but there's also a difference between our concepts and the world that we're struggling to understand. And same as there is with the model. And so he's talking about really the process of approximation and mediation and development here of checking. We're checking as you would if you build a building. You have to check if it works. You have to check if this thing fits into the landscape. Same as with an idea. You have to check whether your original idea needs to be amended and needs to be developed or is wrong. So this is how I see it. The deviations from the image are then corrected, as he says, in accordance with concrete conditions. And that, to me, that's the process of cognitive practice and real practice, actual practice, social practice, adjusting and developing your concepts in relation to a changing reality.
Thanks. Ralph, you have unfrozen now, so if you want to say something about mouse, that would be great.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. There's not that much I can say because I have trouble assimilating this very dense prose. I should be accustomed to it, but I do have trouble digesting it. And as far as the previous paragraph is concerned, the last couple sentences about desubjectification and some of this kind of eludes me in terms of being able to digest it. As far as mathematics, of course, I think he's correct. And up to a point, it's really only the point at which axiomatic mathematics sort of transcends its direct relationship to less formal reasoning that you find the problem. And of course, that's the problem that Ilyenkov doesn't really address. I've actually had discussions many decades ago with these very discussions, like one of the founders of category theory, which is the most abstract form of mathematical logic, Saunders MacLean. And he will go back to the beginning and say, well, all this comes from counting and measuring. But then when you get to a certain point, you have a problem of the direct correlation, although you can, in fact, use this to deal with physics and other things as well. You just have these questions of alternative axiomatic systems, and you can't say, like, this is the correct one and this is the wrong one. There's something more interesting that goes on that goes beyond what we're discussing. I won't get into it, but I think, of course, that it's true. When you first recognize the concept historically of circles and of the Pythagorean theorem and all these other things, and even the development of the calculus, you are relating to the physical world. That's where it begins. And then it goes past that. So as far as what's said here, of course, it is true. The interesting parts, of course, is when you go beyond the direct relationship to developing something to understand these physical quantities. And some mathematicians do recognize that there is kind of a discrepancy between sort of your somewhat informal reasoning and proving theorems, and then some of the more abstract logical issues involved. That gets beyond what they're doing. But as I say, it's an interesting thing that could be developed in the future. You see, because it does sort of go beyond what we're discussing here. And that's why whenever we find these comments about, labor and social activity and other things, sometimes it seems a little vague because there's so much more concretely to be developed. So that's all I can say. The previous paragraph, as I say, some things I just find difficult understanding while you're moving on to subsequent paragraphs. It's just tough for me to digest exactly what's being said.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that point. He does earlier, I guess you could take him to be also contributing to like the value of Platonism as well in that debate as well. Anything else about this bit? That we just read. I mean, yeah, I guess we've said quite a lot about mathematical objects already, and Ralph just extended that for us. So why don't we read on So does anyone mind reading the paragraph starting, this presupposes the ability? Miguel?
Yeah. Let me lower the hand. Okay. This presupposes the ability to consciously compare an ideal image of reality with actual reality itself, external to and independent of this image of existence, still not idealized, still not transformed into something ideal. In this case, the ideal also appears as a special object for the individual, who may purposely change it in accordance with the requirements, brackets, needs of activity. Contrariwise, if the ideal image is assimilated by the individual only formally, merely as a rigid procedural scheme without understanding its origins and connection with the real, between brackets, and idealized reality, the individual will prove incapable of relating critically to the ideal image, that is, as towards a special object, different from oneself. In this case, he seems to merge with it. He cannot put in front of him as an object comparable with real reality and change it in accordance with reality. In this case, strictly speaking, the individual does not act with the ideal image and on the basis of this image. Rather, this dogmatized image acts in them and through them. Here, it is not the ideal image which proves to be an active function of the individual, but, on the contrary, the individual is a function of the image, reigning over consciousness and will as external to the given scheme, as though an alienated image, a fetish, a system of indisputable rules of unknown origins. Such a consciousness exactly accords with the idealist understanding of the nature of the ideal, in particular with the neo-positivist one.
Thank you. Okay, so any comments there? It brings in needs. Sorry, go on, Olga.
There are two notices to this text. The first is towards to special object. Contrariwise, if the ideal image is assimilated by the individual only formally, and so on, yes, individual will prove incapable of relating critically to the ideal image, that is, as towards or a special object different from this individual. The object does not differ from itself, but from individual. And the second point, last but one sentence about image reigning over consciousness and will as externally given scheme. That is all.
Thank you. Any comments about the section? Yeah, so it reintroduces need as part of this. Yeah, Paul?
Just very briefly, I think it's a very important paragraph because if he's saying, as far as I can see, that if you don't recognize the objectivity of the origins of the ideal, then and you reverse this process and you invert the relationship, you end up being dominated by an image, and you're incapable of understanding what you're involved in, and then that leads to all sorts of uncritical approaches and some, in politics, terrible mistakes. I think this is also an attack on the leadership of the Soviet Union at this particular time, who were dominated by an unrelated image of what was going on in the country and led to some terrible errors. So I think it's a warning about if you're uncritical and you don't have the relationship in a correct materialist relationship, then you are unable to investigate the origins and to go further. And you get dominated, and it leads to tremendous image making in the head. This is dominating consciousness. In other words, you are dominated by it rather than being able to comprehend to investigate and to develop your practice in it, seems to me. Maybe this is the way I read it.
Right. Thank you. Sigurd?
We are having new plans for the basic schools in Norway. They are reformed, and this it's an American concept, but it's debated about superficial and deep learning. I mean, so and it's a big debate because I'm myself I'm a student for this training, so we are discussing these new plans, these new concepts. What does it really mean about the deep learning? I find the Ilyenkov very interesting in this manner. He is of course not incorporated, but this contrast of a formal image and an image that you really sort of understand. I mean, I cannot understand anything else that it's about the same. It's about some kind of also concretization of what is meant with the deep learning, which the kids in Norwegian schools, as I understand it, it's American curriculums are sort of and teachers obliged to. I mean, this is so. Yeah, comment.
Thank you. Okay, anything else? Okay, should we? I mean, yeah, there are various things we could say about neopositivism. I mean, even back, Carnap literally thought everything was reducible to how how something appears to me individually. But yeah, should we keep going and read the last four paragraphs then? If we don't have anything to say here, then we shall. All right. So for a final time, any volunteers? Okay. Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, great.
And vice versa, the materialist understanding of the ideal becomes natural for someone in a communist society, where culture does not oppose the individual as something externally assigned, something autonomous and alien, but is a form of one's dynamic activity. In a communist society, as Marx has shown, the fact that all cultural forms are the essence only of human forms of activity becomes immediately obvious. Something that in the conditions of a bourgeois society is revealed only by way of theoretical analysis, dispelling the necessary illusions of this society.
Oh, yeah, keep going if that's okay.
Okay. Everything that has a fixed form, such as the product, etc., appears as merely a moment, a vanishing moment. The condition and objectification of the process are themselves equally moments of it, and its only subjects are the individuals, but individuals in mutual relationships, which they equally reproduce and produce anew. The constant process of their own movement, in which they renew themselves even as they renew the world of wealth they create. I go on?
Yeah.
Okay. Any basis for, give me 1 second, please. Any basis for a representation of the ideal is an independent substance, independent of the activity of individuals and externally determining their activity. This appears here. The ideal exists only where there is human personality and its individuality. Therefore, the further development of the ideal is the prerogative of psychology, researching the process of the establishment of personal action in the ideal form of reality. The philosophical scheme of the ideal is exhausted by the resolution of the issue of the common, socio-historical nature of the ideal and of the role and function of the ideal image in the process of the real, material, and practical transformation of the nature of social being, and the condition within which the existence of the ideal as an active form of activity of a socially determined individual is possible. This problem was first resolved only on a materialist basis, enriched by the achievement of philosophical dialectics, that is, only on the basis of dialectical materialism. This problem could not and cannot, between brackets by its very nature, be resolved on any other basis.
Thank you very much. Any comments? Lars?
Well, I think the last section here actually summarizes very beautifully, you know, that is kind of kind of research program for the future, which I think is very interestingly formulated here. And so it opens up for a further development of the ideal, which I think is extremely interesting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lars. And Karina?
I think the paragraph where he says in a communist society, if you go 3 paragraphs up where Miguel started reading, vice versa, the materialist understanding the idea becomes natural for someone in a communist society, for culture and so on. And then this is Ilyenkov's ideal, it's Marx's ideal and Ilyenkov's ideal of a communist society, which we know didn't exist in the Soviet Union in that ideal way that Ilyenkov describes it. So, I mean, he doesn't say there's a contradiction between this ideal and the reality that's around him. He doesn't say that, but I think we can see it's implied. And for anybody reading it, it would have stood out this as being different than reality. So,
yeah.
And the last, not the very last sentence, but when he says it's exhausted by, I wonder what the Russian word there is. Is it exhausted? The philosophical scheme of the ideal is exhausted by the resolution?
Исчерпана. Проблема исчерпана.
So like spent?
Исчерпана.
It's not resolved, is it resolved?
Not resolved, but like spent.
We cannot do any more in philosophical field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he was hurry a bit.
I think he was hurrying, yeah. It's not exhausted at all. There's an awful lot to be done, especially in transforming social being.
Yeah, and okay.
He was writing that with the encyclopedia in mind and the circumstances of the time.
But what does he really mean with this passage you read, Karina? That this true nature of the ideal, yeah, the objects, the concepts, will in a communist society be sort of automatically or perceived. How come should this be? So it is reachable in a bourgeois society as well, but only through this kind of meticulous theoretical analysis. But in a communist society, it will be some sort of self-evident, right? But this is a pedagogical challenge then, that all the citizens of a communist society should have this mode of thinking, this analysis sort of internalized and see the world like this. Yes.
Maybe not only pedagogical challenge. The society must be interested in such pedagogical process. to give to the mass all the depth of learning, yes? Not everyone, society is interested in it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I agree with all
Andrew?
Sorry.
Am I? As Ralph put in the chat, I mean the core point in race to the last question is that in the social organisation of an exploitative society, you'll have systematic distortions. It's not that a communist society is everyone knows the truth perfectly, but in a communist society, you don't have the systematic distortions which arise in exploitative society, a class society, where there'll be an ideology which suits the capitalist class. More specifically, in capitalist exploitative relations, you have commodity fetishism, which is a very sophisticated development of a series of distortions which make commodities appear natural to us. So again, you wouldn't have commodity fetishism in a communist society, which would not be based on a predominance of commodity production. Just coming on to Corinna's point, I would stress what I take from these last two paragraphs is firstly thinking about the distinction between different academic disciplines. And what you've got here is Ilyenkov talking about the limits of philosophy. That doesn't mean the limits of academic thinking or intellectual thinking. He's talking about where there's a role for psychology. So he's building a picture of where there's philosophy, where is its domain, but where's psychology in its domain, and personality and individuality. He's talking about there's a role for psychology there. After you've done your abstract philosophy, your general philosophy, then there's more to look at, which psychology can do. I think that's really important. It's not something you see, or I see Ilyenkov stressing in many places, so I found it a good read. And I was struck by how it fit with what Lars's comments have been several times. Lars is asking, where's the individual? Where's the individual? Usually Ilyenkov doesn't seem to give you a clear answer. And here in these paragraphs, he is. He's saying, well, the individual is something we can study. Psychology will do it beyond what philosophy does it. But we do need the philosophy as well.
Thank you very much. I think we can wrap up. Back to Karina.